So let's take a look at how we can create alphas using meshes inside of ZBrush. So I'll begin by loading up just the polymesh star. You'll find that under 3D meshes here. We'll draw it on the canvas and then press the T key to go into edit mode. I'll orient it so we're looking straight down the y-axis onto the top of this star. Now, there's two ways to create a 3D alpha from this mesh. Now, in the previous chapter, we did vector displacement map brushes, and those use a three-dimensional alpha that is based on a vector displacement, where you can basically displace around curvature. Standard alphas like this are grayscale. We can extract it from this mesh, but it's not going to work around a 90-degree angle. So this alpha is not going to be able to capture this negative space underneath the widest point of this star. The first method of doing this is to go to the Alpha menu, and we can click From Mesh. Now, when you do Alpha from Mesh, it gives you the option to change the orientation of your three-dimensional object here when you store the alpha. And you navigate this just like you would ZBrush by clicking in the window, hold down the Shift key, and you can snap to a particular view. You can also change your map size here, so I can change it from 512 to maybe 1024. Then click OK. Now you see we've captured this alpha. So if we want to use the alpha, I'll go to the light box. Under the tool menu, I'll just open up a polysphere. That replaces my active Z tool with the polysphere, and we'll divide this up because to reproduce the shape of the alpha, we need to have enough geometry that it will accurately show the form that we just created. So the standard brush with the dot stroke and this alpha is just going to drag that alpha along the surface like that, which in and of itself is an interesting shape. If I change my stroke to drag rectangle, it's going to draw a single instance of that alpha out, like so. Now my Z intensity is set to 25. If I turn that up to 100, I get something along these lines here. Now, you see that it's feathering off the tips of our alpha. It's not quite the same shape that we stored with our mesh. To get something more accurate, you could adjust your focal shift, turn your focal shift down to -100, click and drag, and that's going to give you a much more accurate representation of that shape. We'll undo back to our original sphere. Now, if I were to go back to my polymesh star, and this time, instead of going to alpha from mesh, I'm going to go to brush from mesh. Now, you'll remember we used this when we had sculpted that tentacle form, or that knuckle, that leg form, that mandible, from the poly plane. If you use brush from mesh and your current mesh is a polyplane from which you have sculpted an object, ZBrush is going to know to create a vector displacement map brush. Since we just have a 3D object on screen, ZBrush will create an alpha instead. Now, these tend to work best using a chisel brush or a layer brush. So for the vector displacement map brushes, we used a chisel brush. This time we're going to use a layer-based brush. So I'm going to go to B for brush, L for layer, and select the layer brush. So I have a layer brush selected here. Now, when I do brush from mesh, as opposed to alpha from mesh, we have another option. So if I go to brush from mesh, you see it adds this as a multi-mesh brush. So I've now stored this in this orientation. If I change to this orientation and do brush from mesh, it will append this other alpha into that brush. So if we go back to our polysphere, this time I'm going to go to transform. I'm going to turn on symmetry. I'm going to make the symmetry radial by pressing the radial button here, and we'll set the radial count to 4 instances. So now you see we get this instancing along the surface like this. If I click and drag, it gives me a drag stroke or a dot stroke. If I change to the drag rectangle stroke, now it's going to give me a single instance of that alpha, but the intensity is quite low. If I wanted 100%, turn up 100% Z intensity, click and drag, and there we get our full alpha effect. These are really effective for creating hard surface details like greebling, little surface boxes and seams and any sort of mechanical shapes that you might want to add in using alphas. This is particularly well suited for that. I've changed now from the front-facing alpha to the top-facing alpha, and I click drag, and here you see we get that different view. I can change to the facing star alpha and draw another one, and you see how easy it is to store multiple variations of this in a single brush. So let's rotate around to the other side here. And let's take a look at what happens if we go to the alpha menu, or excuse me, go to the brush menu and so let's look at what happens now if we go to the brush menu and open up depth. Now we have the ability to adjust the depth at which this brush impacts the surface. So if I take this brush and turn on depth mask, this allows me to control the upper and lower fall off of the alpha's effect. So if I turn this down, click and drag, I get this. Now if I go to the brush controls and then drag this down, that black line represents the surface of the model, and the upper curve is the upper effect of the brush. Watch what happens when we do that. You see it clips that surface. So if we draw this out much larger, you see we can get an entirely different type of shape, a very interesting sort of spiny form. And that's just by virtue of the upper limit being controlled by the depth mask. And there's two options on here. You can control the upper and lower limits on this, and this usually comes into play with things like the planar brushes and the hard surface brushes. So if we do this, you can see the effect. We can plateau those shapes out. Let's switch over to our other orientation. Go to brush, let's bring the depth down, and then try this one. And this gives us this very interesting sort of spiky curvature here. It's clipping off the edges there. So we'll undo that, go back to brush, and let's raise that depth control a little bit more, and then draw that out again, and you can see the differential we get. Now if we keep pulling this out, it's going to keep limiting based on how far off the surface that this alpha starts to push, because again, it is depth masking the effect of the brush. Now, what if we wanted to create our own object to store as an alpha? I'll go back to the Polymesh star, and let's just snap to a front view here. And I'll press W to bring up the gizmo, and we'll convert this into a polycube. Go into frame mode, and you can see we've just got a simple polygon cube. And I will scale this down in the Z-axis. And let's go to B for brush, Z for Z modeler, and select the Z modeler brush. Now it tells us that dynamic draw size needs to be enabled. Just click OK. And I'm going to bevel the edges of this. I'm going to mouse over an edge and press the space bar, and it's going to give me edge actions. I'll select bevel, and we'll do edge loop complete, and we'll choose soft edge. Click and drag, and that gives me a nice bevel on this edge. Now I will mouse over a face, press the space bar, and let's do inset, and we'll do polygroup island. And that's going to inset this island of polygrouped faces. And we will inset center and border, and we'll do equidistant. So let's click and drag, and that gives me a nice inset there. Now I'm going to hold down the Alt key, and I'm going to click these faces here. I want to put a polygroup on these faces. Mouse over the face, and we'll do a QMesh, polygroup island, and let's click and drag, and that will push those in. Let's go ahead and select these one more time. Hold the Alt key down. Let's select these faces. And we'll do another inset. Inset these in. And then we will, because it's automatically polygrouped it, we'll just go ahead and Q Mesh. We're set to Polygroup Island, so we can bring these out. And let's bevel this edge. Now that's grabbing this edge loop here. See, it's going around this way. So I'm not going to be able to get the full border without actually making some little edits to my settings. So I'm going to hold it in the spacebar, do edge loop partial. There we go. Let's turn on our X symmetry. And there we go. And there we go. So we can get a little bit of a bevel on there. And let's select these faces here just by alt-clicking on them and go to Scale. And we'll scale Mesh Center, click and drag, and scale those down. Now, if we leave frame mode and rotate around our object, you see what we've created here. We've got an interesting sort of mechanical box shape. I could further edit this if I chose to. Maybe we want to create a little Q-Mesh extrusions on the side. So I'll go to Q-Mesh and go back into frame mode. And I'll just hold down the Alt key and select these faces here, maybe these faces here, and then these faces here. And let's do Polygroup All. And then click drag this out. And that will give us a bit of further modification. So I've created an object, positioned it on screen, and I will go to my layer brush again. So I'm going to go to B for brush, and let's select L for layer. Grab the layer brush, and you can see that I've got those two alphas still stored. I will go to brush, from mesh, and then that stores this new mesh in that brush. And I can come through here and I can still select my previous stores. Let's go back to our polysphere and let's undo some of those changes we made to it, and then we'll apply this alpha. So I'm going to add another subdivision level, so it's up to 6 million polygons to better support the level of detail that we want to get. Click and drag, and you see it's dragging that out, but it's giving me a fall off on it. So what we want to do is we want to go back to our brush settings. Let's undo that. Go back to our brush settings. Turn off depth mask, and once again, click drag, and that gives us our full alpha. Now we get this nice crisp alpha here, and if you get any sort of strange edging on there, it's just going to be a result of the fact that that alpha is, that those faces are shooting straight back in space. So also that's going to be dependent on the resolution of the mesh from which you're trying to grow the alpha. So you need the resolution to support the shape you're trying to make here. So if we undo this, draw it a little bit lighter, or a little bit smaller, here you see we're getting some stepping there. And if we go into frame mode, you see the result right there. So how do we correct for that? I'm going to go ahead and undo this, go back to my geometry here, press the W key to go into the gizmo and hit the gear icon, and let's select a taper. And let's taper this brush along the top here, so it becomes more of sort of a trapezoid shape, like this. Now watch what happens if we store this one, where we've got an angle going back towards the base of these pieces. So I'll go to Brush, from Mesh, go back to our polysphere, turn off frame mode, and we're still at 6 million faces. And now when I draw this alpha, you see we don't get that sort of clipping along the edges. That's because when a surface is perpendicular to the camera, when you're storing the alpha, it's just a single drop off. It's a sheer drop. This gives us a little bit of a gradient, so we get a nicer edge there. And that gradient doesn't have to be this pronounced. You can make it less pronounced as long as it's not an exact 90-degree angle. If you want something that is a 90-degree angle like that, I would recommend using a vector displacement brush, because it will give you a better result than the grayscale alpha, even though the vector displacement brush is usually associated with things displacing around a 90-degree angle, around a curvature. So let's go ahead and undo that, turn our X symmetry back on. You can see that this is a great tool for just very quickly building up some mechanical details. As I'm drawing out my alpha, I'll go ahead and rotate to orient it. And there we go. Oops, I overdrew that just a little bit. Let's draw that again. And then bring these pieces together. We can get a really neat kind of interlocking mechanical shape here. Let's get those 2 points lined up. I just want those angles lined up. There we go. Rotate around. You can also hold down the Alt key and it will subtract that shape. So we can make negative spaces from this alpha as well, like this. Now, I'm a big fan of radial symmetry when I'm detailing things. I think it's just a lot of fun, and you can control your radial symmetry under the transform menu. We can bring this back up to 8 if we want. And I'm going to go to my settings here, transform radial symmetry. Right now it's on X. I'm going to set it to Z, so we're looking straight down the model at our radial symmetry. Click and drag. You can draw these alphas out, and they will blend together as they meet. There we go. And then we get a shape like this. Let's bring it in here, hold down the Alt key, click and drag. It's almost like a mandala effect here. So it's quite cool. We can come over here, hold down the Alt key, and subtract these alphas here. I'm going to undo that and snap to a side view so we can get this a little bit more accurate. Click, drag. And if I hold down the Shift key, I can snap my alpha as I drag it. There we go. And let's change to this alpha here and click, drag. And that draws out these sort of spiky shapes here. I want to get that sort of scalloped form that we had in those spikes, so I'll undo that and I'll go back to the brush controls, turn on depth mask, and then draw that again. And it's got a very sort of Mordor quality to it. I like these sort of spikes. It reminds me of something out of the Witch King's Lair, for example. I'm going to undo that and come up here a little bit higher to the top of the surface and then drag them out here. There we go. So we get this nice spiky form here. Hold down the Alt key, and of course you can do the same thing as negative spaces. So the nice thing about this method of brush from mesh is you can store a variety of different alphas here in a single brush. And then you can save this brush out separately by going to Brush, Save As, and give it a specifying name. For example, Mechanical Detail Brush, or Mech Brush, or Greeble Brush. And you can store that, and then you can always add more alphas to it. Now, what if we wanted to take alphas out? What if I don't have a use for this particular one? Well, we can edit this brush by going to our brush menu. Under the Create menu, you can delete mesh. So if I click Delete Mesh, it deletes that particular mesh out. I could also copy all meshes. So I can copy all these meshes to the clipboard, and maybe go to B for brush, C for chisel, and select the chisel brush. And I can then paste, append, and that appends all those meshes to the chisel brush here. Now, if I use these meshes with the chisel brush, and you can see that these are VDM brushes, whereas these are coming out of a single mesh. You can see the plane associated with these. So if I click drag, let's change to a drag rectangle stroke on this. Click drag. The chisel brush gives us a nice sharp quality. Let's go back to our original mesh that we created without the beveling. And I'm going to undo back to our original surface. Now I'm going to use, you remember this particular version of the brush had the 90-degree angle drop off. So if I use this with the drag rectangle stroke on a chisel brush, it will turn off my radial symmetry. I'll show you the effect that we get. Let's turn on Z add, so we're adding with this instead. You see the effect of the beveling, or the stepping along the edge, is not quite as pronounced when we're using the chisel brush. Go to our depth controls, set that here. Turn on depth mask, turn that up, bring this down just slightly. And there you can see it will limit based on that brush fall off in the depth controls. Turn that up, do the same stroke. There we go. Let's change our brush size. Let's turn this up, and let's undo back to our original sphere so we've got a clean surface to work on. Change to our Polymesh star, click and drag, and here you go. We're getting a limit. You see that? It's limiting. Turn off depth mask, and our brush will not be limited. So the depth mask is going to limit your brush as you drag it out. Without, it will not limit it. Now, if we go back to our layer brush, where we stored these meshes originally, so we've seen that we can copy meshes. You can copy one mesh. So copy meshes copies them all. Copy one will just copy your selected one. You can paste replace, or you can paste append. So paste replace will replace the currently selected mesh with another one. You can paste insert, which will insert it in between two meshes here. So instead of putting it at the end of the list, it will put it between these two. And we've already seen delete. And then you can edit the brush credit. If you want to give yourself or someone else credit for the brush, you can edit that just by clicking this button, and you can put in your name and your website. Click OK, and that will be stored with the brush if you save it out and then maybe put it up for sale online or distribute it for free with the ZBrush community. So let's take a look now at how we can use these in practice. I've got a helmet model here, which will be available for you in the downloads for the course. And I've got this broken up into multiple subtools. Right now I'm on the faceplate subtool. If we solo that, you can see this. And if you want to learn how to make something like this, there's an entire video on hard surface sculpting in ZBrush where we talk about sculpting like this and the techniques that are used here. So first off, I want to make sure that my mesh is dense enough. Right now, it's only 570,000 faces, so I'm going to add 1 or 2 subdivision levels to that. So we're up to 9 million. Now, let's go ahead and grab one of our stored alphas in this layer brush. We are on drag rectangle stroke, and we have our alpha stored there. Now I have the straight fall off alpha, and I've got the one with a slight bevel to it. So I'd like to put a couple greeble details onto this helmet. So we'll put these sort of sockets right here. Place those at about that point there. Now, if they are too high, maybe I want to clip them. I can undo that, remember, with Control-Z, and we'll go to our brush menu. Let's tear this off on the side of the screen. Come down here to depth, and remember, we can depth mask this. So if I click drag now, let's bring this down. There you go. We can clip that brush as we draw it on the surface. So we're clipping the effect. So we've put some of these pieces here. Maybe we'll put another little, we'll do a negative one here. Now what's interesting about this helmet is I've got a shell underneath it, and that's specifically so when I carve in panel lines, I'll have another material visible underneath. So if we put a negative space here, that will reveal some of that other material. There we go. Now, let's do something a little bit more spiky and aggressive. Let's select our star alpha that we stored. Now, I will click drag, and we get this really nice spike effect up here. But I want that that clipping to give me the curvature there. So I'm going to undo that, adjust my depth masking, and then click drag. Make sure my Z intensity is 100%. Let's bring my depth masking down. And then try that again. So it's going to require a smaller draw size. Let's turn our draw size down. And there we go. That's what I'm looking for. I want these little curved spikes here. Bring up that. Bring my depth mask up. Let's do another one here. Get it just right. There we go. So this is a nice way that you can test things. I've drawn this out. Let me zoom in so you can see this better. I've drawn this like so. And I want to undo this, and I want to make a change here. Oops. I have a touch screen, so I accidentally moved my object. So I'll draw that again. There we go. And I'm going to undo it. Now I'm going to come back over here to my depth control, and I'm going to make a change to it. I'm going to bring this down, and then I'm going to go to stroke, modifiers, replay last, and that will replay my last stroke and let me see the effect of that change. I have a hotkey set for that. As you can see, I have that hotkey to Alt-1. So I'll undo that again, and then let's bring this down to here, and then I'll press my replay stroke hotkey, and you can see the effect of it. So I can come through here and tinker with these settings and get something closer to what I want just by replaying my stroke with the different settings. So let's undo that, bring that up to here, and replay stroke. There we go. So it's one thing to do these with just a single drag rectangle. What if we wanted them to follow a path? So what I would do then is change to my dot stroke, click drag, and it's going to draw these alphas out along a stroke. Now that's not the default behavior. I'm going to go to the stroke menu and turn off roll. So this is what you will typically get as your default behavior, and this may well be something that you want. So if we come over here, zoom in a little bit, draw our stroke, that type of shape may very well be something that you'd like to see on your surface. If I press the L key to turn on lazy mouse, go to my stroke settings, go to lazy mouse, I can turn my lazy radius up, and that will give me more of a delay on this brush so I can adjust my stroke as I draw it. I can change my draw size, turn that up, and that in and of itself is quite an interesting form there. However, maybe I want this to be different in its orientation. So if I go to my alpha controls here, I have my alpha there. If I rotate the alpha like this and then draw my stroke, I get more of a hard edge like this. Let's undo that, and let's turn our brush size up. And this time I'll change my focal shift. I'll turn my focal shift down a little bit. You see the effect that that gives us. Now, what if I want more of a space between each alpha instance, which is what I want in this case? I want there to be kind of a row of these spikes going around the edges of this helmet. I'll go to my stroke menu, and under modifiers, I have roll. I'll turn that on, and I can control the distance with the roll distance slider there. So I will click and drag, and this is going to roll that alpha along my brush stroke. Now I need to turn my draw size down. I want these to be smaller this time, and I'm going to solo this particular part so I can navigate it on screen a bit easier. So I'll click drag, and this will duplicate that alpha and roll it along that curve. So let's take a look at using these brushes in action. I have a sculpture of a mechanical helmet here. It's broken up into multiple subtools, and we're currently on the face plate. That's a separate piece, and you can see that it is 9 million faces. Now, if you want to learn more about sculpting like this, we have a whole chapter on hard surface in ZBrush that I'd encourage you to watch if you have not already. So I'm going to go to my layer brush, and we're going to select the Polymesh 3D that we have here. It's the bit of greeble detail, mechanical detail with a slight bevel. We'll come down here on the sides of the faceplate. Using drag rectangle stroke, we will click drag to add that alpha to the surface. And we get a nice bit of mechanical detail there, just contained in that alpha. Now I have another shell underneath here. If you see, if I select this subtool and solo it, I've got an inner shell. So that means if I use subtract on this outer shell, hold down the Alt key and subtract, I can reveal negative spaces just by using that alpha, holding down the Alt key, so I can knock out space like that. So let's switch over to our star that we stored, which gives us those nice spikes. If I click drag, I can get a shape like that. So I want to add some sort of spiky fins on here. Now remember, if I go to my brush, depth control, turn on depth mask, and then click and drag, it will draw out that alpha, but it will mask it based upon depth. So let's undo that. Let's cancel that auto save there. Oh, fuck off. So we will click and drag. Now you see we get this nice limit on that brush, which gives us these very interesting spike shapes like this. So I like those. Let's put another couple down here on the sides of the faceplate. Just click and drag. And as we draw that out, it's going to limit the brush and give you a little bit of curvature to it. Let's go ahead and undo that. Let's bring that outer depth mask down and then try again. There we go. So we can get a nice sort of spiky shape on the sides here. Now let's try something different. Let's change our stroke now to a dot stroke. And I will go to my stroke menu and tear this off to the side of the screen so we have access to the settings. Now under the modifiers, if I turn on roll and then click and drag, this will roll out copies of the mesh. Let's adjust our roll distance and set it to 1. So if I click drag, this will draw a stroke that repeats that alpha along the length of the stroke. I'm going to turn off my depth masking, and let's do that stroke one more time. Let's turn our draw size up, and I'll draw right along this surface here, and you see we get this repeating pattern of that alpha. Now, if I change my roll distance, if I turn this down, I can reduce the number or the space between each individual instance. So I can get something along those lines. If we turn it down even lower, we can get a very interesting, almost centipede kind of shape here. Let's undo that, and let's really turn this all the way down. Oh, that's too small. Let's set this to 0.5. There we go. So as I draw this stroke, 0.09, there you go. We can really cluster these together. Let's set this to 1. Let's set it to let's set it to 0.5. There we go. 0.2. There we go. So we can really bring these things tight together. But you'll also notice the orientation is straight up and down. So what if we want to change that? I'll undo back to our original surface, and we'll go to the alpha menu, and here with that alpha selected, I can just rotate it. So now that I've rotated it, when I click and drag, this is the effect that we get. If I change my roll distance, let's undo my stroke, and then we'll draw again. We get this nice spiny kind of sawtooth blade running down the sides of that helmet. And of course, we can further adjust this. Let's set it back to just 1. And that gives us this effect here. Now, there's a couple ways of getting a similar effect to this. You'll notice that if I change my direction, it sort of doubles up on the stroke. So that may not be something that's beneficial to you as you're drawing. If you want to change your stroke so you're actually drawing along a curve or a line, what we'll do in this case is use lazy mouse. So I will turn on roll, turn on lazy mouse, turn on backtrack, turn on line, turn on snap to track. This forces your brush to follow a line, and snap to track forces it to stay confined to that line. Turn track curvature all the way up, and that tracks the curvature under the brush. So watch this. If I were to then click drag, I get a straight line. Draw my line as far as I want it to go, and then backtrack along the line, and it will conform that stroke to that straight line. Now, what if I want to follow a path? I'll change this from line to path, and then click drag, and I can draw a path like this. Then backtrack it, and I will follow that path. But once again, you see we get this interference here where they overlap one another. So there's another way that we can get a similar effect. What I'll do is I'll turn off roll, I'll take lazy mouse, and I will bring my lazy step up. So let's set this to 1.4, for example. Backtrack is on, path is on. So click and drag, draw my path, and then backtrack it, and you see that that improves that stepping effect that we get. And I can change the lazy step and that will change the distance between each step. So if we set this maybe to 1, and then draw our path again, that's the effect that we get. You see that's much, much better than what we were getting before with roll. So we don't have that interference where the pieces sort of step over one another. If I undo that, turn my draw size up, and then draw that path again, we get a larger shape. So this is quite a fun way of going in there and adding details to a surface, like spines, spikes, sawtooth blades, any sort of repeating shape that you might want to add. This makes that very, very easy to do, and it's just the lazy step under your lazy mouse settings. I can turn off backtrack and just use regular lazy mouse, which just gives me that red line, and then I can freehand draw these curves just like this. So maybe I want to do a variety of these, make this a very, very spiky helmet. There we go. Turn my draw size down, and we can draw even smaller ones like this. And of course, we can still hold down the Alt key and make a negative out of this instead of a positive. This is a great way to create things like stitching or repeating fasteners. It's just to use lazy mouse with lazy step adjusted. So hopefully you found this helpful, and you can see how you can utilize these in your own workflow. There's a lot of possibilities using lazy mouse, using lazy step, and using roll in conjunction with these custom alphas. I think you'll find that you can build up a library of vector displacement brushes and 3D alpha brushes pretty quickly, just through the process of working on your own projects. You store those and save them in a brush folder, and you'll always have them accessible. You can also save them in a brush folder that's inside your ZBrush install folder, so you can always access them via the Lightbox. One thing that I will recommend is if you do make a lot of custom brushes, I would not necessarily put them all in the root brush folder that loads up with ZBrush by default, because that will throw off your hotkeys here, and it will actually slow down the interactivity of this menu. You don't want this to get too much bigger. So hopefully you found this helpful, and I'll see you in the next lesson.